Good morning. I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk to you a little bit about the definitions that we're going to be discussing throughout the next 3, 4, 5 months together. And talk to you a little bit about emergency management, what it means to be an emergency manager, the definitions, specifically about emergency management, and some of the sort of larger buzzwords like risk, hazard, that sort of stuff. So, what's emergency management? So, you honestly can find probably 150 different definitions of what emergency management is. But I generally like to land on the FEMA definition. And FEMA definition says that emergency management is the managerial function charged with creating the framework within which communities reduce vulnerability to hazards and cope with disasters. So that's quite a mouthful. I think it's a very simplistic definition, but that's basically what emergency management is. Think about it like this, right? So even on a small event, you're going to have fire, police, EMS, state partners. You're going to have potentially private contractors, so on and so forth. So you've got, possibly dozens of people coming and going from a disaster or an emergency scene. There has to be somebody who can effectively manage that, and we have all kinds of sort of tools at our fingertips, including the Incident Command System and National Incident Management. We'll talk about that later on, but we have mechanisms for sort of managing this massive, oftentimes ever-growing, larger than we can control situation, even on small events. And so how do we handle that, right? How do we make sure that, because the fireman shows up and everything looks like a fire, right? The police show up, everything looks like a violation of the law. A contractor, electric contractor shows up, everything looks like the issue's there. And so there has to be somebody who can control all that, keep all of that stuff together, and that's our job as emergency managers. So, secondly is this idea of a hazard. What's a hazard? Hazard refers to the potential for extreme events to affect people, property, the natural environment in a given location. So a hazard is something that that we're going to sort of interact with, not to be misinterpreted as risk. Risk is a situation involving exposure to a danger, right? So hazards, or that sort of the interaction with a hazard, either raises or drops our level of risk. And so, for instance, we live next to a large body of water, river, or something like that, and there's a possibility that it will flood. The hazard is the water, right? And the idea that it might. The risk is the flooding piece of it. So we interact with that water all the time. The level of risk, whether it's up or down, based on if we're getting tons of rain, something like that. So then finally, I pulled up a couple additional definitions of emergency management, and I just want to talk to you. The World Health Organization, as we're talking about emergency management, an emergency, what is that? What's the difference between an emergency, say a crisis, and a disaster? We mistakenly use them interchangeably, and that's a problem on our end, as the people who are discussing it. It's not just like within academia, even on the ground, right? Boots on the ground, I've seen it in the local newspaper referred to, a 2-car crash, no injuries, in some way referring to it as some sort of the disaster scene or something like that. So we sometimes misuse those, but So the World Health Organization defines an emergency as a state in which the normal procedures are interrupted and immediate measures need to be taken to prevent the state of turning into a disaster. So think about it like this, right? So, an emergency's here, right? Without doing something, without taking some steps to fix the emergency, it may in fact raise to the level of a disaster. A disaster being events that produce large amounts of losses, whether that be monetarily, financial, or monetarily, lives lost, something like that. So if you sort of begin thinking about that and those definitions, and it helps you start to wrap your mind around this concept of emergency management, what it is, what it means, what's the field all about, right? FEMA has laid out some, sort of their vision and the mission and what of the emergency manager and the principles that go into emergency management, and I want to give those to you, so you have them. And the principles of emergency management, comprehensive, right? Emergency managers consider and to take into account all hazards, all phases, all stakeholders, and all impacts relevant to the disaster or the emergency, right? So we're not just sort of focused in any one area. We're trying to look at everything. It's our job to be ready for whatever we encounter. Emergency management needs to be progressive, right? Emergency managers anticipate future disasters and take preventative and preparatory measures to build disaster-resistant and disaster-resilient communities. Our job is not just to respond. Our job is to think ahead, realize, hey, what lessons can we take away from the last event that we had, and how can we make our area, whatever we're responsible for, safer, more resilient, so on and so forth. Emergency managers need to be risk-driven. Emergency managers use sound risk management principles like hazard identification, risk analysis. We do this to begin to sort of assign priorities and what needs to be looked at first, right? If you're living in the Ohio, for instance, which is where I'm at, our level of like tsunami preparedness is lower than it would be, say, when we're looking at winter storms. The likelihood that we're going to encounter winter storms up here, so we need to be thinking about, do we put all of our time, money, resources into this or this? It's integrated, right? Emergency managers ensure unity of effort among all levels of government and all elements of the community. Our job is to make this process, to streamline the process. We're not looking to duplicate services. We're not looking to duplicate resources. We're not deploying something if it's already there, so on and so forth. It's collaborative. We strive to work together. As the manager, as the emergency manager, your role is to make sure that police and fire and EMS and the local people and the nonprofits, that everything works together and works together well and efficient. It's coordinated. Your job is in some communities, you may be called the emergency coordinator as opposed to the manager. You need to be making sure that all of this stuff works together. If it doesn't, really our job is moot and we fail. We drop the ball. It needs to be flexible. You need to be creative and innovative and use just sort of different types of approaches to get the job done. There are a lot of players in this field. There's a lot of people, and with a lot of different groups and players, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of sort of thought about how we do some of this stuff. Your job is to sort of be flexible enough to make it work. And then finally, professional. Emergency managers value a science and knowledge-based approach. We're not just out here sort of making it up as we go. This is based on lessons learned. It's based on science. It's based on experts who have done this or have studied this, have come up with sort of the best practices, and that's how we approach this. We're not approaching it just something we've come up with. This is based on the sort of the totality of all the disasters and crises and emergencies that have happened, and people have written about them and they've studied them, and that's how we kind of come up with our body of knowledge within the emergency management field. So I hope this was helpful, and if you're considering sort of or thinking, hey, is this for me, just Google it, look it up a little bit more, look at the jobs and that sort of stuff. You'll find that this is a fun, interesting, and sort of a challenging field that I don't think anyone who sort of who really jumps in with both feet regrets it all. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time.